She said it in front of people, like it was already decided and just needed witnesses. We were standing near the bar at a gallery opening. Her world, her music, her clients drifting past with plastic smiles. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't look angry. She sounded bored. According to her, I only wanted her body. That was the problem. That was the reason things had gone quiet between us. She framed it like an accusation, like a diagnosis. I didn't answer. Not because I was shocked. Because I understood what silence does in a room like that. She was an art director. Words were her tools. Emotion was her currency. I worked in technical procurement, where decisions were made quietly and mistakes were expensive. I stood there with a drink I hadn't touched, watching her laugh seconds later with a producer she'd introduced me to earlier as a friend from work. His name was Evan. He touched her elbow when he spoke. She didn't move away. People noticed the pause. Someone glanced at me, then away. She kept talking, explaining herself to the group, not to me. Months without touch were suddenly my fault, publicly summarized as a character flaw. I didn't correct her. I didn't defend myself. I didn't leave either. I watched how easily the room accepted her version. I watched how comfortable she looked standing in it. And I felt something click, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly enough that I knew this wasn't about that night anymore. It had been building long before she decided to say it out loud. The shift started quietly, the way structural damage usually does. 2 days after the gallery, a co-worker from my department asked if everything was all right at home. He didn't ask directly. He mentioned my wife's name casually, said he'd seen her at a late meeting space downtown with a producer he knew from a previous contract. Same guy, Evan. The tone wasn't gossip. It was neutral, almost careful, like he was handing me something fragile. I didn't react. I thanked him and went back to my screen. Orders still needed approval. Numbers still had to align. That's how my world worked. Nothing collapsed just because new information entered the system. At home, nothing changed on the surface. She moved through the apartment with the same distracted grace. Phone always face down, notifications silenced. Physical distance had already become normal. The couch, the edge of the bed, casual apologies about being tired, overwhelmed, emotionally spent. No arguments. No explanations asked for. One evening, she mentioned a late project review. She said it without looking at me, already reaching for her keys. The phrasing was smooth, practiced. I watched her reflection in the hallway mirror adjust itself before she left. That reminder from work echoed again, not as suspicion, but as confirmation. I didn't follow. I didn't check locations. I didn't ask questions designed to trap her. Instead, I started noticing patterns. Which nights repeated? Which excuses recycled? Which details stayed vague? By the end of that week, I understood something clearly. This wasn't confusion or exhaustion. This was allocation. Time, energy, touch, redirected elsewhere. And the decision hadn't been recent. The evidence didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated, quietly, through systems she forgot I understood. Shared accounts, calendar overlaps, charges that didn't match the story she told herself. I wasn't hunting. I was reconciling. That was my job, after all. Find inconsistencies before they became losses. There were hotel parking fees logged as ride shares. Late dinners coded as client meetings. A pattern of withdrawals that coincided with nights she said she needed space. None of it screamed betrayal on its own. Together, it formed a clean line. Her phone never left her hand anymore, but she'd stopped guarding it. That's what confidence does. It makes people careless. I didn't open messages. I didn't need to. Names repeated in notifications, previewed just long enough. Evan again. Always Evan. No questions in his messages. No explanations requested. Just availability. At home, she spoke in emotional language, saying she felt unseen, disconnected, overwhelmed by expectations. She framed distance as growth. She framed absence as self-care. She didn't notice the change in me. The way I stopped reaching. The way I adjusted without discussion. One morning, she brushed past me in the kitchen and paused, like she might say something. She didn't. I stepped back anyway. From that day on, physical contact ended completely. Not as punishment, as alignment. I finalized a spreadsheet that afternoon, closing a long-running vendor contract. Everything balanced. For the first time in months, so did I? I wasn't confused anymore. I was simply done collecting data. I didn't announce anything. I didn't pack dramatically or change my routine in ways she could measure. I just started removing myself from shared systems. One morning, I left earlier than usual and didn't come back that night. I booked a short-term place across town under my own name and redirected my direct deposit before the week ended. I turned my phone to silent. Not airplane mode. Silent was enough. Notifications stacked. Missed calls multiplied. I could see them without engaging. Her messages shifted tone over days, from logistical to concerned, then to confused. She asked if something was wrong without asking what she'd done. I didn't answer. At home, she noticed the absence in stages. First, my side of the closet stayed untouched. Then the fridge stopped refilling itself. Then the card tied to shared expenses declined. Not canceled. Paused. That difference mattered. She showed up once at my office lobby, standing where security could see her. I wasn't there. I had adjusted my schedule. Later, a colleague mentioned she'd looked unsettled, asked questions that didn't land. People noticed that too. From a distance, I watched how quickly control slips when access disappears. No explanations. No confrontation. Just silence where she expected reassurance. I wasn't hiding. I was visible in the ways that mattered. Work continued. Meetings happened. My life didn't stop. It simply stopped including her. By the end of the second week, I filed the paperwork. No note attached. No warning. The documents moved faster than her understanding did. Evan didn't disappear with me. He became more visible. That was the mistake. People like him rely on momentum and rooms that don't ask questions. I wasn't interested in him personally, but our paths overlapped in ways he didn't realize. Procurement touches everything eventually. Vendors. Studios. Temporary spaces booked under rushed budgets. I didn't reach out. I didn't warn anyone. I simply stopped smoothing things over. A few routine verifications that would normally be waved through were allowed to follow their proper channels. Paperwork slowed. Questions surfaced. A production space he favored failed a compliance check tied to insurance language most people skipped. Meetings got postponed, then rescheduled, then quietly dropped. None of it traced back to me. It never does when you let systems do what they're designed to do. His nights stayed busy. His days became complicated. She noticed the shift before she understood it. Her calls mentioned stress at work, a producer under pressure, timelines slipping. She framed it as chaos. I recognized structure unraveling. The difference mattered. One evening, she finally reached me. Not angry, not accusatory. She explained herself like a pitch, saying emotional burnout had distorted everything, that nothing physical had happened the way it looked. I listened without interrupting. When she paused, waiting for a response, I gave her one sentence. I told her she had already chosen. After that, communication moved to attorneys. Clean. Efficient. No stories attached. Evan's name never appeared again. It didn't need to. The space he occupied was collapsing on its own. The shift reached her publicly before it reached her privately. That's how these things usually land. At a small industry dinner she'd insisted on attending alone. Conversation stalled when she joined tables. Not dramatically, just a fraction too long before responses came. A friend she relied on for introductions redirected attention elsewhere. Someone she'd mentored avoided eye contact entirely. No one confronted her. No one needed to. The questions lived in the pauses. A colleague mentioned my absence casually, asking if I was traveling. She answered too quickly, framing it as a mutual decision, a reset. The phrasing didn't settle the room. Someone else changed the subject. It didn't come back. Later, I heard from a former client that she'd asked about me, indirectly, trying to place my name back into conversations where it used to belong. The response she got wasn't hostile. It was neutral. People said they hadn't seen me, that they assumed I'd moved on. The assumption stuck. Evan stopped appearing with her at events. Not because they were finished, but because association had become inconvenient. His own issues were starting to surface. He needed clean optics. She needed reassurance. Neither got what they wanted. At work, her influence narrowed. Fewer calls returned. Fewer quick approvals. She wasn't excluded. She was simply no longer buffered. I didn't attend any of it. I watched from a distance through secondhand updates and shifting patterns. The social structure she relied on didn't turn against her. It just stopped holding her up. She reached out more often once the noise around her faded. Not with accusations. With updates she assumed I needed. Small explanations offered without being asked. Mentions of therapy sessions scheduled, of taking space from work, of figuring things out. I didn't respond. The messages kept coming anyway, stacking into a record of effort no one was witnessing. I saw her once from across a coffee shop near my temporary place. She didn't see me. She sat alone at a corner table, phone on the surface, screen lighting up and dimming without her touching it. She looked around too often, like she was waiting to be recognized by someone who used to know her routine. No one approached. Evan wasn't there. He hadn't been for a while. His name stopped appearing in the updates she sent, replaced by vague references to disappointment and timing. The distance between them showed in what she stopped mentioning. When paperwork required her signature, she responded immediately. Documents moved faster than conversations ever had. She signed where indicated. No notes added. No resistance offered. The efficiency surprised her attorney, according to someone who mentioned it later. It didn't surprise me. At night, her messages slowed, then stopped. Not because she found peace, but because there was no audience left to react. The isolation wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. Access removed, attention redirected, momentum gone. I stayed out of view, close enough to observe, far enough not to interfere. She finally asked to see me when there was nothing left to stabilize. Not to argue, not to negotiate. She framed it as closure, as something mature people did when things ended without noise. I agreed to a short meeting in a public place where neither of us could control the atmosphere. She arrived early and chose a table that faced the door. When I walked in, her posture changed before her expression did. She looked relieved and unsettled at the same time. I sat down. I didn't touch her. I didn't mirror her energy. I stayed exactly as I was. She spoke first, carefully. She said the distance had distorted everything, that exhaustion had blurred her judgment, that she hadn't felt wanted as a person, only desired physically, and that it had pushed her towards someone who didn't ask questions. She said it like context would soften impact. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct details. When she paused, waiting for something to land, I told her there was nothing left to explain. I reminded her that I had stopped reaching long before I stopped showing up. That silence had been my answer. She leaned forward, lowering her voice, trying to reconnect through proximity. I stayed back. The gap between us didn't close. It held. She asked if there was any version of this where we reset. I stood up instead of answering. I told her the process was already moving forward, that I wasn't angry, that I was finished. She stayed seated as I left. I didn't look back. The collapse didn't announce itself. It unfolded through absences she couldn't explain away. Projects reassigned without discussion. Invitations that stopped arriving. Names she used to call for leverage no longer answering. The producer she'd leaned on disappeared first, folding back into his own recovery mode, focused on saving what he could. She wasn't part of that equation anymore. I heard about it indirectly. Someone mentioned she'd left a meeting early, visibly shaken after being told a campaign was moving forward without her input. Another said she'd shown up at a small event uninvited and lingered too long near people who didn't engage. Nothing dramatic, just repeated signals that her position had shifted. She tried to reach me again after that, not with explanations this time, with fragments. Memories she assumed we shared the same way. References to things I used to handle without being asked. The messages came late and went unanswered. Silence doesn't argue. It just stays. I saw her once more, by accident, outside a building we used to walk past together. She looked smaller, not physically, structurally, like something that had lost internal support. She noticed me this time. Our eyes met briefly. I didn't stop. I didn't change pace. Later, someone told me she'd asked if I was doing well. Not directly. Through layers. The answer she got was simple. Yes. By then, her world had narrowed to explanations no one needed and apologies no one requested. The space I left behind wasn't filled. It echoed. The final exchange didn't happen in person. It didn't need to. By the time the documents reached their last stage, everything emotional had already been processed through distance. The paperwork arrived clean, without commentary. Signatures. Dates. Closure handled by systems, not voices. She sent one last message before it was finalized. Not long. Not dramatic. She said she finally understood what I meant when I stopped reaching. She said the months without touch weren't about her needing space, but about her needing someone who wouldn't ask her to be accountable. She didn't ask me to come back. She asked if I ever missed her. I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to hurt her, because the question itself belonged to a version of us that no longer existed. I had already stepped out of that frame. Later, I heard she told people I disappeared. Then I shut down. That I walked away without explanation. The story traveled better that way. It required less responsibility. I didn't correct it. Silence keeps its shape. I moved into a permanent place not far from where I worked. New routines settled in quickly. No gaps to explain. No energy diverted. My life didn't feel empty. It felt precise. The last thing I heard she said about me came through someone else, filtered and softened. She said she never thought I would actually leave. I didn't disappear. I just stopped showing up where I wasn't respected. Been through it. When they crossed a line, and you made sure they felt it.